So, in answer to the unresolved questions from the previous video, yes, I was able to make it back home. No, I was not able to take Amtrak the entire way, and yes, I'm still displeased over that. That entire fiasco was just over 2 months ago, as we were rapidly approaching the September 15th deadline for a potential nationwide rail strike. After President Biden's Emergency Mediation Board made their ruling, there was a 1-month-long cooling-off period which allowed for the unions and the carriers to continue to negotiate to find a potential deal. In these contract negotiations, the railroads wanted a 16% increase in pay, while the unions wanted a 28% increase in pay. The National Mediation Board effectively split the proposals down the middle, recommending a 22% increase in pay. Despite this potential increase in pay, there were still a wide variety of fundamental issues regarding quality of life for rail labor. These included paid days off, sick time, as well as scheduling. These quality of life issues were brought to the forefront by BNSF's introduction of its high-vis attendance policy. I discussed high-vis earlier this year, and from the stories that I read on that video, as well as the general controversy surrounding the attendance policy, I came to realize that quality of life was not just an issue at BNSF. Quality of life was an issue at all of the Class 1 railroads. This was indeed something that the coalition of union negotiators emphasized in their negotiations with the carriers. On a brief side tangent, this brings me to my side of the story. I was an Amtrak passenger going from Boston to Chicago and then ultimately to San Francisco. I was able to take Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited from Boston to Chicago on September 6th without any issue. However, on September 12th, one day before I was set to depart on the California Zephyr from Chicago and go to Emeryville, California, I had received the email notification that my train was canceled. In preparation for the potential strike, Amtrak was systematically canceling its trains, and lo and behold, the long-distance trains were the very first ones to be canceled. As every hour during that week in September passed, it seemed more and more likely that we were going to have a strike. While the unions and the carriers were in negotiations, Congress, in accordance with the Railway Labor Act, was in efforts to prevent any possible work stoppage. Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina called for unanimous consent, which would have forced a vote on a joint resolution that would have forced the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations on the carriers and the unions. However, the motion for unanimous consent was shot down by who else? The senator from Vermont, Mr. Bernie Sanders. With the delay on a Senate vote for the joint resolution, it allowed for the unions and the carriers to continue negotiations, and just before the deadline for a strike, a tentative agreement was reached between the unions and the carriers. While the agreement still necessitated ratification by the union membership, it delayed any potential strike action, which was cause for celebration by various politicians and the news media. Because of an agreement with the unions to not cross anyone else's picket line, it required all 12 unions to ratify the tentative agreement. With the ratification process, the timeline for any potential strike action was delayed once into the middle of October, and then it was further postponed into some point in November, and ultimately it reached the day of December 9th. During this 2-month wait, we have had 8 unions vote to approve the tentative agreement, and we have had 4 unions vote to reject the tentative agreement, those being the Brotherhood of Railway Signalmen, the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees, the Brotherhood of Boilermakers, and then the Smart Transportation Division. Of those 4, Smart Transportation Division, led by President Jeremy Ferguson, is the largest union to reject the tentative agreement. The Smart Transportation Division results were released alongside the results for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Technicians. The BLET approved the tentative agreement, while Smart Transportation Division voted down the agreement. While the tentative agreement includes back pay and overall wage increases, the quality of life issues were still enough for those 4 unions to vote down the agreement. In specific, the sick days and the attendance policies have been sources of concern for the unions for years. One of the key aspects of the tentative agreement was that employees would have 3 sick days allowed per year. However, these days had to be scheduled a month in advance and could only be on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or a Thursday. The other major caveat being that these sick days were unpaid.
I voted no on the contract because we deserve more.
It does not meet the requirements for quality of life that we need. We need time to sleep, we need time to rest, we need time to enjoy our lives. We don't have any of that now.
We're considered essential employees, and we don't have a single paid sick day to use when we're off. We've worked through the pandemic, we were considered essential, and now it seems like we're expendable.
With all of the results having come forward from the union votes, this has allowed for the unions and the carriers to go back to the negotiating table just before the December 9th deadline. The unions and the carriers, mainly through the Association of American Railroads, their lobbying firm, have publicly stated that they are ready to make a deal, but there is still one major caveat to all of this, and it is, once again, Congress. It is still possible that in the event that there is no deal reached by the December 9th deadline, that Congress would force the original Presidential Emergency Board recommendations on both the carriers and the unions. This would mean that the concessions from the carriers in the tentative agreement, such as the sick days, would be eliminated. As we await a potential deal from the carriers and the unions, as well as potential congressional action, there is still one glaring issue. The railroads are still a mess. In the piece that I did in July discussing what was wrong with the railroads, I discussed a number of issues, but I will go ahead and give a brief summary of that right now. Starting in 2015, a concept known as precision scheduled railroading, which has its origins with E. Hunter Harrison and the Canadian National, began to be introduced in the United States. Upon the introduction of precision scheduled railroading, profits for these railroads went up, all the while employment numbers, train crews, conductors, maintenance men, all of those positions began to see drastic cuts. This process can be analogized by surgeons sedating a patient and then removing as many organs and limbs as possible, all in an experiment to see with just how little the patient can survive. Except in this case, the surgeons are railroad executives and the patient is the entire American railroad apparatus, and also the American economy and the American public like you and I. As to be expected, that has wreaked havoc on the railroads, all resulting in the urgent issues in freight railroading hearing carried out by the Surface Transportation Board earlier this year. And in the time since I uploaded that piece in July, those issues have done nothing but worsen. Employees have still been resigning and incidents have still been occurring. This loss of the thousands upon thousands of hours of expertise in the railroads, compounded with the issues that precision scheduled railroading already brings, it has led to significantly more dangerous operations. We still have underpowered trains being sent out onto the main lines, and as a result of all those resignations and retirements, we have fewer and fewer experienced crews to handle those trains. It is true that we are in the middle of an economic slowdown that may soften the blow that would be caused by an underperforming rail network, but it is still alarming nonetheless. One aspect of the railroads that I did not cover in that July piece, and what ultimately has an effect regardless of economic conditions, is dispatching. And just this year there have been a couple of particularly shocking incidents. The first one of these incidents made it to the internet, and, well, you can just take a listen for yourself.
Allegheny.
OC Allegheny.
Go ahead there, over.
Want us to hold at the brickyard and send the recrew here? We're only good for about another 17 minutes.
Yeah, roger that. Get to the brick there and go ahead and tie it down there, over.
Tie it down? You want us to tie this down?
Yeah, put on 30 brakes.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
You have to do it in 17 minutes, too.
It'll take me 15 to get off the train.
What's he saying?
Just to tie it down.
Oh, stupid. My God, where do they get these people? Allegheny CO5.
CO5.
In your current location, is there any way for you guys to cut away and tie down that way for you to cut away from the 12G.
Where are we going? Back up to MG?
No, you're just gonna, I'm gonna have one of these eastbound trains pick you guys up and drop you off at the head end of the 12G so we can get this thing down to roads to get swapped.
Not gonna happen without a helper on the rear, pal. I don't know where you came from, but you've never been out here.
Clearly. I'm just asking if it was possible. That's why I'm asking.
No, and you should not be stopping these trains on this mountain. There's a mountain up here. Whoever trained you didn't do a very good job at all.
Yes, you heard that right. A dispatcher, knowing that a crew had only a few minutes left on their hours of service, wanted them to tie down a manifest train on a 2.2% grade. The second incident I wanted to discuss was the Bertram siding collision, which took place on September 8th, 2022, along the Union Pacific's Sunset Route. On September 8th, 2022, an eastbound Union Pacific stack train was routed into the Bertram siding on the Sunset Route. However, the siding was occupied by a string of flat cars. The train collided into the set of flat cars, killing both of the crewmen. The incident at the Bertram siding is a terrifying example of the carelessness that has taken place on the railroads, oftentimes sadly with fatal results. And what has been happening all the meanwhile, with the executives still boasting about record profits and all, is that the American economy is still held hostage by the railroad executives. Regardless of whether or not all 12 of the unions reach agreements with carriers, or if Congress ultimately shuts down that process and forces the Presidential Emergency Board ruling onto the carriers and the unions, there is still a terrifying problem occurring in our railroads. The fact that railroad executives and business leaders as a whole are calling on the federal government to save them from their own misdoings is a glaring admission of guilt. These railroad executives have done nothing short of loot their own railroads, and even though James Foote and Sheryl Sandborn are leaving their positions, it still does not undo any of the damage. Ultimately, I fear that with the tumultuous labor issues facing the railroads, as well as the issues that, well, the railroads have caused on their own, we are very rapidly heading towards another service meltdown, just like the one that we had at the beginning of this year. We already have record numbers of Union Pacific embargoes on various customers. So as an outside observer, there would be a number of things that I would recommend. For starters, there need to be two-person crews, even though the likes of Sheryl Sandborn have argued against two-person crews in terms of being competitive. No, two-person crews are not up for negotiation, and it is for the safety of the crews and for the equipment. In order to alleviate the fatigue issues that union members have been bringing forward for years, the railroads must undo the workforce cuts that took place under precision-scheduled railroading. The railroads and their lobbyists may want to convince you that it is simply impossible for them to adequately hire enough people, but they only have themselves to blame because they have abused their own workforce. On the legislative front, it is necessary for the Railway Labor Act to be addressed and, if necessary, ultimately repealed because of its grotesque pro-corporate nature. And finally, it might even be necessary to consider nationalizing the railroads themselves and entirely removing the profit motivation. It is painfully obvious that while rail profits and the stock prices have increased, rail safety and the rail quality of service has decreased, all while Wall Street hedge funds profit and while railroad executives profit based on the compensation packages that are full of stock options. The billions of dollars in stock buybacks carried out by these railroads represents nothing more than greed. Those billions of dollars could have been used towards more capital projects. They could have been used towards capturing more of the market share from other forms of transportation. They could have been used towards hiring more employees to better fill out the workforce. Instead, railroad executives took revenue from their own railroad and used it to increase the value of their own assets through the forms of stock and stock options. We as a nation and we as an economy simply cannot afford to be wasteful in that regard. On a closing note, however, I would like to thank everyone who watched and most especially left their story, or their family story, on the BNSF high-vis piece that I did, on the testimony from Matt Burkhart, as well as the What's Wrong with the Railroads video. I learned so much from all of those stories and gained a better understanding of the anguish and the suffering taking place in the railroad workforce. I once again encourage everyone to look through all of those comments and look through all of those stories and see how what has been happening in the railroads has affected individuals, how it has affected families, and how it's ultimately affected the country. If and when more news takes place, I will be sure to cover it, but until then, thank you for watching.